Hey guys. Hey Nell. Type in the chat, guys. Love to hear from you all. Hi, Chris Parker. Madhu. Anne. I've got a great Newcastle. Nice. I'm actually heading down to New South Wales tomorrow. Driving down to Victoria, so we're heading through down the Newell, which will be nice. Hey, Colleen. I'm looking forward to it as well. Very excited. I thought I'd start everything a little bit early just so we could have a bit of a chat. Um, I've got a couple of things to talk about just before we kick in with our amazing guest, Robert. So I might as well do that now. I've got a little video to play. I'm just sort of figuring out how to use all these different things. So if I do. So you should have a video. Just let's watch this video. It's a very quick one, but it's just talking about library lovers with Maya Linnell, which is the counter to what we do here, but she does some really cool stuff, and this is what's happening next month. So have a look. Yeah, so it's really cool. I got to go to the last one of those a few weeks ago now, but it was really fun. And if you guys enjoy these chats, you'll enjoy that a lot. So make sure you head along there for sure. So I'm just saying hi to everyone. Hello, Mum. Mum's here, guys. Susie, yeah, yeah, I've packed a good thick jacket, Suzanne. Thank you, yeah, or Susan, sorry. Hey, Anne. Hi, Jane. Hi, Greg and Joyce. Hey, guys. Always exciting to do this. I look forward to this every month. I'm going to put something in the chat here, guys. There's a link that I'm sending through to all of you. I've started this Facebook group for Ben's Book Club. And I'd love for you guys to get along there and join that, because what we can do is start to have these discussions through the month and talk about the books we're going to read. And I can actually cheat a little bit and steal some of your questions. But yeah, it'd be really cool. So if you guys are keen, I've just put the Facebook group link into the chat. So would love to see you over there so we can talk about the book as we're reading it, which would be really fun. Hey, Peter. We'll introduce Robert Lukins now, who is, let's be honest, the real reason we're all here. Robert Lukins is a wonderful man, a wonderful human being. He has a smile that lights up any room he's in. He is a writer and he lives in Melbourne. And his first novel, The Everlasting Sunday, was published in 2018 by UQP and in Italy as well, which is pretty cool, in 2019. And his second novel, which is the one we're here to talk about today, Loveland, was published in Australia just this year, just in March. So, Robert, if you wouldn't mind turning on your video so everyone can see how wonderful you are. It's not lies, buddy. I'm speaking from my heart. Hey, mate, how are
Hello.
you?
Hello. I've come here with my invisible glass of rosé. Yeah, there we are. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, pleasure. Um, yeah, so how are you, Robert? How is it going with the book, and how is things feeling in Melbourne and the launch of the book in March? How's the feedback been going from the book?
Yeah, it's been really lovely. It's been you do learn a bit from. So this is my second novel, and you do learn a lot.
Mm,
I think you learn a lot through the first book about how to pace yourself emotionally and
yeah.
psychologically.
Hmm.
I think in when your first book comes out, quite understandably, anytime you do any press or any events or anything, you take 3 days off work either side of it to psych yourself up for it, and then you have 6 coffees and you do all this stuff, and then you do it, and it's this endless kind of peaks and troughs. But
Yeah.
you realize afterwards that actually you can actually dispense with a lot of that and just enjoy the process. And
Yeah.
so I found this one. Look, it's a few months later now, and I'm still smiling. Still, my hands aren't shaking, and I'm still
Oh,
here.
that's
So
nice.
it's been really lovely, and it's nice to get that sort of second run on the board and
Mm.
feel a bit more. You go like, oh, okay, this is actually, I write some books and they might actually come out. That's
Yeah, not a one-hit wonder, so to speak.
and other than that, it's as a few people in the chat have mentioned, I'm in Melbourne and it's very cold. I've got my
Yes.
thickest cardigan on, so
Well, I'm a
that's how it's been.
Victorian by trade, so you can see I've got a t-shirt because it's Queensland, but it is actually cooler up here at the moment, which is a bit
Yeah.
crazy. Um, what I'm assuming you do a lot of these sorts of things, and you've gone out to book clubs and you've spoken at libraries and things like that. What are some of the things that you enjoy the most about this part of the process? Actually, I mean, I know it's in digital form, but you're meeting readers here of your work.
Yeah, it's genuinely everything. It's I think that's something that I hadn't really thought about much or prepared for, particularly before
Mm,
my first book and with this one, is that writing used to be such an insular process for me. It was me in my room and my book, and there were two people involved. It was me and the book, and it was just this closed circuit. And then it was that moment of my first novel coming out, and actually, it was my first writing event was at the Perth Writers Festival. And after my event, someone came up to me at the writing booth, and they'd already read my book and just talked to me for 5 minutes about that book. And I honestly just had this epiphanal cathartic moment. I had this incredibly moving moment because I think
yeah.
until then, because my first novel was the first piece of fiction I'd ever published. I'd never had a short story published or anything. So I'd never had that kind of feedback loop.
Mm,
And it opened the world up to me, and it really became what it's all about. That's the only thing I'm interested in. I get moved genuinely on a kind of weekly, daily basis. People are really kind, and like people tracking down my email address and sending me an email after they read my book or talking to me, or even just it existing is really this part of the process that I honestly never used to think about, because I used to just focus entirely on the writing.
yeah,
And I think that's important,
for
and it's
sure.
it's a bit of a superpower in some ways when you're writing, uh, but it's a bit of a trick on yourself as well, because then it's what you need to do to keep writing, because you can't write imagining people looking over your shoulder as you're writing. But once the book's actually out, you can let that sort of carapace down, and you can actually realize that's all that matters. So just having, like, I've been to little book clubs at a pub with 4 people on a cold night, and they're the moments I'll remember forever. It won't
Mm,
be when the book was on the shelf, or when the book came out or something, or some reviewers at it. It's like talking to 4 readers at a book, because that's what I am. I'm a reader. I'm the person at the bookshop buying the book. I'm the guy at the library getting books out. So it's
mm.
to finish that kind of loop is I I hadn't realized what a part of it would be, and it ends up being the bit I'm interested in.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes with books and reading, um, sorry, I'm just noticing. That's okay, no worries. Have a nice night. Someone just got called away. That's totally okay. Guys, remember to post your questions and comments for Robert. If you want to comment on how lovely he looks, you can put that in the chat as well. Um, I feel like reading and writing and doing this sort of thing now, I feel like in some ways it's almost, I wouldn't say replaced a type of church, but I think it has for some people. Like, I feel like the way the church works when it's working best is when there's a bunch of people who come in and talk about the meaning of life and big ideas and these big, difficult morality concepts. And
Hmm.
I feel like having these conversations is one of the last sort of venues where people who perhaps aren't religious in that way, they can come together and actually, I don't know, talk about these things that the book has stirred in them, and it's like
Yeah.
an avenue. That's what I find anyway. Do you feel like the same sort of thing?
Yeah, I really do, and it's amazing. Sometimes you do an event or something like online, or sometimes online even more so, because sometimes I feel like I'm speaking to people right now that I won't get the chance to actually visit in person. The idea that right now there are people who could and should be watching the news, but they're sitting here and talking to us now. That's so beautiful and it's so amazing.
It is nice.
And those connections really, it honestly is these things that you remember 2 years down the track, and it's the things you look back on. And it's amazing sometimes how deep these kind of conversations, the level they can get to. I've done events where you realize 35 minutes in, you've got like tears welling in your eyes, or you're talking about something, you're opening up to people in a way, because reading is such an intimate process at its best. And when someone has read your work and you've expressed yourself in that book, you're really scratching into some pretty deep territory. And it's just sometimes you get to the end of a question and an event and everyone has to kind of take a breath and you just kind of freshen up, because you all, well, it's this very special place for all of us, isn't it? Like that's as a writer, and like I'm a reader 1,000 times before I'm a writer. And so I understand how important these things are. This is how we live and breathe in the world through these books. And there's not a separation. Yeah.
I do feel like though, because I read too, but I do feel a lot of my life reading a lot of books. You can see a lot of my books. I felt very isolated doing it. No, that's the wrong word. It felt like a private conversation between the author and myself. And like you say, it felt very intimate. So it certainly it felt broadening, I think, and inclusive. But I never used to go to these sorts of things. Like when I was a kid growing up, I don't think I was very cool for reading books. So I guess as an adult, it's very nice that we can all come together and do these sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think there has been a bit of a switch too. I think in the last, like we've probably seen it in our adult lifetimes, like these things didn't, and not just talking about Zoom and things, but there weren't avenues for all these things. When I was 17 and absolutely the maddest, keenest reader in history, I didn't have book events I could go to. Like it was once a year I'd go. So I was from the Sunshine Coast. I grew up on the Sunshine Coast, and so I went to the Brisbane Writers Festival when I could, and that was, I remember being starstruck at that thing.
Yeah.
I once like talking to Bryce Courtney without knowing it was Bryce Courtney. I was standing outside an event for something else, and this nice old man came up and talked to me, and we're talking for ages, and then we went inside and he walked onto the stage, and I remember things like that, and it just felt like cool. It did feel like tapping into this kind of magical, and I suppose that comes from, because you're right, when you're younger, when you're reading in your room, you're a million miles away in time and place from these writers, and they do feel like these books come down from space.
Yeah, for sure.
It is pretty special now, because now it's just commonplace that there's every week you could go to 10, if you're lucky, online now as well, and libraries, and you can go to 1 million of these events. And I think that's an ecosystem that probably didn't exist as in the form it does now. And I've been amazed at how many book launches I go to, and I just think, I'll just go and have a room temperature white wine and then go on to something else. And then 40 minutes in, you realize you're having this incredibly moving experience.
Meaningful experience. That's cool, man. Well, I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate your book, which I do think does stir a lot of these big questions and big emotions in it. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about the journey to actually writing this novel. I remember we were speaking a little bit about it a little while ago, and actually you sort of helped me a lot with writing to get a travel grant, right? And if I'm not mistaken, you were set to go to Nebraska, which is where a lot of this novel is set, to do research, and then COVID struck. Can you talk us a little bit through what that was like, what it was like to get that news, and I guess having to pivot? And then, I mean, the book is still here. So how did you rally and get to where you published it?
In a completely whole way the cancelling of my month-long trip to Nebraska. So I had flights booked, I had accommodation booked. I was going to spend a month wandering the plains of Nebraska
Oh man.
in March 2020, which is
Oh,
a month in history that I think we'll all look back and remember.
yep.
And it was honestly maybe like 6 or 7 days prior to my flight that we cancelled. Until then, I was like, oh, everyone was sort of, how serious is this thing? So yeah, I was all set to go to Nebraska. I was going to spend a month, and that was going to be the catalyst for sort of finishing the second half of the novel. And then I couldn't go, and it genuinely was, as I see it now, the beginning of the novel as it exists now, because I probably have to backtrack a bit in that Nebraska has been part of my life since I was about 7 or 8 years old. So I remember being about 8 years old and thumbing through my parents' record collection, and it's like Pseudo Echo, Eurogliders, Kevin Bloody Wilson, and then a copy of Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska.
Yeah.
Which, I don't know if people are familiar with this cover, but it's quite a famous cover. But it's a black and white photo taken from the inside of an old beat up pickup truck at night, looking out through the snow at this impossibly distant, impossibly flat Nebraskan horizon, and to this like sunburnt fluoro board short wearing Sunshine Coast kid, this was the most exotic and alien vision I could ever have seen. And I remember being transfixed by it. I remember literally like sitting there like a cliche with my legs crossed, just staring at this album cover.
Yeah, right.
Imagining this world, and this word Nebraska. It sounded great off the tongue. And from that moment I became fixated on Nebraska. And I started reading everything I could. And I know there was a period where I had Nebraska confused with Alaska, because I was just this Sunshine Coast kid. I didn't know anything. And so I remember reading encyclopedias about it, and reading, getting in the library to order in short story collections about Nebraska. But as well as that, it became this place that in that way that you do when you're a child, I imagined this place into existence. It became this place that I built up this great personal mythology about. I would just imagine that horizon. I would imagine what was on the other side of that Bruce Springsteen horizon.
That's amazing.
And so reading all this fiction and non-fiction about Nebraska, but then it mixed in with these very childish in the sense that they were huge ideas of what this place could be. And so, but Nebraska also became this kind of refuge for me. It became as the years went on, I always thought Nebraska to me seemed like this great blank space on the map. It was this great flat nothing that you could just invent in any way you wanted. And I suppose I always thought that if everything went wrong in my life, if all the wheels fell off, if everything went irredeemably wrong, I could always go to Nebraska. There was always Nebraska. I could go there and step into that horizon and reinvent myself as something new. So it did become this place of last resort.
And sorry, this is just all imagined, like off an album cover so far. That's amazing.
Yeah, but then really I was just a child who would, the classic, I would like just stare out the window and imagine these things. And so I had this, through my whole life, I have this, what feels like a very deep and personal connection to a place I've never been. And it's all mixed up with fact and fiction and my imagination. And I don't know where one thing starts and one thing ends. And I was initially very cautious about going to the real Nebraska, because I didn't know how the real Nebraska was going to fit in with this story that had developed in my mind.
Yeah.
And so then finally getting those tickets and planning the whole trip out, and then it being pulled away from under me, was the moment I suddenly set myself free. And I thought, the Nebraska that I'm going to write in this novel is the Nebraska of my childhood imagination. It's a place where fact and fiction and real stories and things I half remember, things I read when I was 10 that I sort of remember, things about Alaska that I probably confused with Nebraska, all these things would go into it. And I would let that be the place that my characters go into. So not going to Nebraska set all that free. I just thought, well, this is a place I know better than the place I grew up. This Nebraska of my mind is a place that I've walked 1,000 times, and I know this place very well. So that's the Nebraska I wrote in this novel.
That's amazing. I had no idea about that. because when I was reading this, I've never been to Nebraska nor to America, but I felt it was very authentic. I was like, oh, this feels like a real place to me. But um, I guess it is a real place. It is a
I
real
think
place to
there's
you,
that
right?
idea, isn't there, of I'm very suspicious of any ideas of kind of objective truth or objective realities. Like the Nebraska, like the you're in Brisbane at the moment, right?
Mm.
I lived in Brisbane for 10 years, and my Brisbane and your Brisbane may as well be two different places. We all come to it with our different
Agree. Yeah.
childhoods and our different eyes, and we see everything differently. So I think sometimes what rings true in a story, it isn't a specific detail about which turn off you take off the highway and which, because you can look those things up. You can sit down for 2 years and look up all those details. And I did that to an excruciating degree. But that isn't what makes something feel real. It's that sense of emotional truth, that sense of emotional place. It doesn't matter how many miles it is, whether it's 83 miles or 93 miles. That isn't what makes something feel real. It's that just feeling like you're tapping into a deep well of experience. And whether that's based on fantasy or reality, in lots of ways doesn't matter. And so I allowed myself to just dip very deeply into this place that I know really well, which, whether or not it bears much resemblance to the real place, is kind of a separate question. But that's,
Wow.
yeah.
And how long did that pivot take you a while to get to? Like when you first got the news, I guess how many days were you sad before you sort of rallied, or was it instant where you were just like, you know
It was
what?
pretty instant. I don't really let myself sit for too long in those things. I quite like to bounce off things. I think I tend to have a 24-hour rule with anything. Any disappointing news or anything, I let myself wallow for 24 hours and that's it. So I'm sure I wallowed for 24 hours. And also, I think I was a bit panicked because I thought, how can I write a book about Nebraska if I've never been to Nebraska? And I thought, well, I've been to a Nebraska. I've been to the one in my mind for the last 30 years of my life.
Yeah.
And I should say, as a PS to that story, I went to Nebraska about 2 weeks ago. So,
And I guess then the question is, how did it stack up?
yeah, well, that's the thing. So I finally got to use that that travel grant that I got to go research Nebraska. Well, that's the thing. It's so curious about. I also find too, when I finish writing a novel, I've been so invested in it and I've been so emotionally present in that novel. There's something about when I finally finished writing that novel, I can't go back to that world. I can't re-enter. I'm so present in it, and it's like walking out the door and closing it, and you can never go back into the same house again. And so I went to Nebraska, and it was incredible, and it was a beautiful place, but it didn't relate to my novel. It was a separate place, as it would have been anyway. In the same way that if I go back to the town I grew up in, I'll recognize things, but it's you can't like that. You can't step in the same river twice. It's that same thing. So
Yeah.
the Nebraska I went and actually walked in 10 days ago was an incredible experience, but something very separate to my novel. My novel, to me, exists in this kind of middle space between past and the future of my brain. But it's something about writing a novel that in some ways you are tying up a million loose ends in your brain, and once they're tied, you can't get back in. That's the feeling of when you finish a novel. To me, is a feeling of incredible closure. Not that things have worked out perfectly, or not that things have worked out how you planned, but you step away from that and you can never go back in, and that's a great thing.
It's kind of cool. Like in this book here, is that, however long you spent imagining that Nebraska, that's what's captured here. You sort of, the magic of it sounds terrible, but it wasn't spoiled by reality. We've got,
No. But also, I should say too, like I really like the idea of, I'm driven a lot by my subconscious in my writing. I just take a back seat to my subconscious and I sort of let my instinct drive things. And I like writing from a place of sort of half knowing things. That can be a really interesting place. Like a story, I remember ghost stories that I've read about Nebraska, and I half remember them and I half confuse them, and then sort of how my subconscious puts that on a page. I find that really fascinating and interesting to write from. And so I liked writing this book from a lifetime of reading about Nebraska. And even it's amazing. I approached quite a few people in some of the small towns that I was going to go visit for this trip. So local historians, local academics. I've got a very good relationship with a local mayor from a small lake town in Nebraska who, as soon as I sent him an email saying I wanted to write about his town and I couldn't get there, got in his pickup truck with his phone and drove around the town, filming out the window, giving me a running commentary of his town that he loves so much and he's so proud of. And I found that everywhere I went, as soon as I said Carter Lake, Iowa, I want to write about this town, the local historians would send, they would loved it. So I'm flooded with real information. I'm flooded, with all that. Yeah. I've done the work. Yeah. And I find it really interesting to have that in my head and then just write from this place of it all, just in the same way that when you live in a place for 10 years, it's a mixture of fact and reality and your own experience and things you've heard, and your understanding of green slopes is different to my understanding of green slopes, and so I embrace that kind of living in that state of half knowledge, I suppose.
It's all selective too, right? Because when you're writing about Nebraska, or when, if either one of us were to write about Brisbane, what we put in there is the stuff that matters the most to us. It's all interpretive. It doesn't mean that it's not based in a type of truth. It's just, I notice different things to what you notice, and my characters would notice different things to what your characters would notice.
I think it depends what you're doing too. Like there's some kinds of books that what I just described about Nebraska would be a terrible idea. There's some kinds of, it depends what you're trying to do. Ultimately it got to the point with my Nebraska story that I'd contemplated at one point not calling it Nebraska. I contemplated just coming up with another name for it, but it's so deeply rooted in that place. And I kind of tried to get across some of this longing for that place that I have. It needed to be Nebraska because it is a real place that I've witnessed from afar from such a long time. And I wanted to recreate that idea. So my character, an Australian character from the Sunshine Coast, travels to Nebraska and is only there for a short time, a week, 2 weeks. And I wanted to kind of recreate that idea of landing in a place that feels incredibly rich in history and place and presence, which these American towns are, as any place is, I suppose. But the idea of this naive Sunshine Coast person landing in this place and just being confronted with all this, they were never going to understand the place or know the place. They were just going to be bombarded with these sensations of the humidity and the smells and the accents and the wind coming off the lake, and it was meant to be a kind of disorienting experience. So I suppose I tried to bring that to it.
Yeah, and it's absolutely fair. And if you were writing about a person who was native there, it would be a different type of book. But you're right, you have this person come in from outside and enter the world. Can I ask you the question here? And this is I'm going to throw you a little bit of a tricky one. Sorry?
Please do. I love that.
It's not really that. I'm pretty light on. Sorry, I'd like to say yes, Nell. So we've got to that question. And then Susan loves book clubs as well. And she said it's very helpful in giving her a deadline to read books, which I think, we can get lost in the shuffle, right? The endless to be read pile.
And I'm in a book club myself, and I find it quite good. In that book club, I read books that I wouldn't read myself. Yeah. And they're often like, I've got a bunch of friends who they all realized that they hadn't read a book since they finished high school, and they were disgusted at themselves. So we started this book club. So I'm reading books. So I'm a voracious reader, but I'm reading books with people who are just sort of getting back into reading. So I'm reading a lot of stuff that I wouldn't otherwise read, which is fantastic.
That's cool. It's always good. But my trickier question is that your book, The Everlasting Sunday, which came out in 2018, and I was on a podcast once and was asked to recommend my favorite ever debut novel, and I said your novel, not to be complimentary and weird in front of you, but it's probably my favorite novel.
We know each other too well for that.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I love that book, and so it's set for people who haven't read it. I 100% recommend you read it, especially if you enjoyed Loveland. But it's set in a boarding home in England, right? And it's freezing. It's this winter. And then you've written another novel which sort of starts in Australia, but as soon as you're in Australia, we're off to Nebraska. And you're an Australian. And I was wondering why those decisions. Like, obviously you're going subconsciously to the things that draw you in, I'm assuming. But I guess, yeah, can you unpack that? Like, let's get into Robert Lukins. Who is this man?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's a question that I don't know the answer fully to. I am, I suppose, just following my instinct. And I suppose the other thing too is that even though The Everlasting Sunday was my first published novel and this is my second, I've been writing novels since I was 14. I've written a novel a year since I was 14. And the vast majority of those novels are set in Australia. I wrote the first 20 novels I wrote were all set in Australian share houses in Brisbane, or something similar. So for me, it was this sort of later period of my writing, which is the opening period of my writing to the world, is me kind of trying to shake free of that a little bit. A lot of it's kind of a literal and metaphorical me getting out of my bedroom. I've been sitting in my room since the 90s writing novels about Australian bedrooms and Australian living rooms. And I'm just in a, to me, brief period where I'm really enjoying, in that same way that when I was a kid, reading books was my way to explore the world and to learn about the world and travel around the world. All the books I read when I was little, none of them were set in Australia. You know, we were deep in the cultural cringe when I was 12 years old. And it was only as I became sort of a later teen that I became quite fixated on reading lots of Australian authors. But I traveled around the world and time through reading, and I think I'm really enjoying that as a writer at the moment. But to me, it just feels like a bit of a phase. So it's just interesting that I'm sure I will return to writing Australian stories. But even my next, I'm currently writing. Oh, it's a long, drawn-out story, but I basically got hamstrung a bit by. I've got two novels that I want to write at the moment, and they kept competing with each other. So I've just given in, and I'm writing two novels at the same time at the moment.
Oh yeah, that sounds very sensible. Yeah.
And well, until one of them wins the fight, and one of them is set in Greenwich, Connecticut, in America again, and one of them is set in Bristol, in England, in 1788. So once again. That's just where I'm. It's where I'm emotionally placed at the moment. I'm not sure why that is, and I'm not going to fight it. It would seem very alien to me at the moment to return to an Australian living room, even though I read voraciously Australian fiction set in Australia. It's just I'm in a very brief period in my writing career where I'm not writing things in Australia, and it just happens to coincide with when I've worked out how to get some books published.
Yeah, that's interesting, man, and I like that that you have the wherewithal to not, Australian fiction. I'm Australian. I'm better write an Australian. Like, you're just doing the things that you feel drawn to, which I think makes for the best type of books.
Even just on a practical level, like I don't think as a writer it's either in your favor or against your favor to set something in Australia. I think maybe those conversations meant a lot more a couple of decades ago. But just in my experience with publishers and agents and things, I don't think, like, even from that point of view, I don't think anyone particularly is too hung up on the idea of Australian writers having to write Australian stories. But
I agree with that for sure.
But I do feel it's interesting because I love Australian stories. Like I've read hundreds and hundreds of Australian novels written by Australians set in Australia, and some of my most beloved novels are those. So I'm sure I'll return to that at some point.
We've got a couple of comments in the chat here, which it makes my heart very warm here, from Nell and Jane, saying that this is their first ever book club, which is awesome. So thanks for being here. Very welcome, obviously. And remember, if you have questions for Robert, this is where we can ask him anything that you guys have for him. I kind of selfishly just take the reins and ask questions that I'm interested in, which I like, which I want to hear answered. But if you guys have stuff, I'm very happy to ask your questions as well. The other question I had in regard to Everlasting Sunday and Loveland, this might get into real weird technical author stuff, but the tone's different. So Everlasting Sunday to me was a bit more maybe florid or poetic, or it was a bit more maybe mythic or contemplative. It was sort of
Yeah,
like a gentle wind, I guess. I don't know how I'd describe it.
that sounds good to
Love
me.
that's good. Loveland, I think, has equal amounts of craft in it and is equally as well, even maybe more compelling just from the way you've written it. And it's a little bit more, it feels a little more grounded, possibly. And I
Yep.
was wondering about that decision because I do
Yeah.
feel like it's been deliberate from you. The tone is very different. And I guess with Loveland, why did you choose to write it with the voice that you had there?
Yeah. I'm really gratified that it seems deliberate because it absolutely wasn't. Um, I'm the least analytical
Oh no,
and
just gave
least
you so much credit for
and
that.
least deliberate author you've ever encountered in your life.
Wow, okay.
I
Can
honestly
you look at
write.
it in hindsight? Yeah, go on, sorry.
Yeah. No, I write entirely from instinct and my subconscious. I really enjoy the process of sitting down to write, and I get to the end of a piece of writing and I think, like, where did that come from? I don't know where these things come from, and I enjoy that part of the process. And it's something I'm working with now because I think I've been writing like that for a long time. I kind of entered this slightly dream state and just write and am surprised by what ends up on the page. Um, and I'd like to push myself a little further and see what happens when I introduce a little bit of the front part of my brain to
Mm-hmm.
steer the ship a little. But I think the tone, I think everything I've ever written has always been a somewhat dramatic shift in tone.
Mm.
I suppose I try and let the story, the atmosphere and the flavor. I suppose that's what always comes first for me. People often want to know about, like, what comes first, a story or a character or a scene. To me, it's an atmosphere, it's a flavor, it's just a strange ambiguous sense of not even of a place, just of I suppose of a tone. I think the tone comes before anything else.
Yeah,
And
right.
it's just that the Everlasting Sunday was based on, again, I won't get into my long Everlasting Sunday shtick, but I was in the early 2000s, I was a postman in Shropshire in England on my push bike in the snow in winter, and at the end of my delivery round was this abandoned mansion that I would have to deliver mail to at the end of my round, and it was the most magical, mysterious, terrifying, comforting place I'd ever been to. And so that entire novel was an attempt to recreate the exact feeling of what it was like to stand on the crunchy gravel steps of that stone, crumbling, decaying mansion
That's
in the middle
cool.
of winter, looking out at this sort of ancient landscape. And so the whole novel was an attempt to capture that tone. And I think this novel was just an attempt to capture the tone that I have in my mind of this imagined Nebraska, this slightly mythical, slightly almost a slightly drunken state. A kind of someone described it that the novel feels a bit jet lagged. It's like the main character is jet lagged for the whole book, and I like that because that's my feeling of Nebraska. It's a somewhat like the sun is glaring in your eyes, and you need a glass of water, and you haven't had enough sleep, and you're sort of wandering around this rich ancient place, and it's kind of bombarding you.
Hmm.
So I think that led the writing of the story more than anything else.
Yeah, right.
It's something I'm really trying to address in my writing now. I think I'm really trying to challenge myself
Yeah, sure.
to not just always do improvisational jazz, like
Hmm.
that that I can, what happens if I actually sit down and calmly think about what I'm doing. And that's not to say I don't think about what I'm doing. It's all I do is think about it. But
It's a different,
just in the
yeah.
writing process, as because you talk about this quite sensible idea that you make a decision and then follow that through. There was no decision made.
I'd love to ask just the chat in here and just everyone in here, the book club. What are your thoughts on this? Like, I'm really curious about what I'm assuming there's a few people in here who are writers and authors, but I'm wondering about what people think about authors generally. Is the perception that everyone just plots everything out on like a big corkboard with cue cards and things like that with emotional links and red pen and stuff like that? Or did you guys expect that authors sort of make it up a lot of the time as they go, which I guess they're doing anyway with the cue cards, right? But you
Mm.
like to feel things as they happen. I'm actually wondering about your characters as well. Is that the same thing with Casey and Mel and Patrick and everyone in here? Do you sort of discover them as readers discover them in your books as well? You're sort of like, oh, that's a weird decision for that person to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, but then I do, and I suppose this is where I do then, I discover, so I suppose I have a process, I essentially rewrite a lot. I don't edit. I very rarely edit a piece of work. I'm ritually rewriting. So to me, the novel is, I can see the seams where I finished writing one day and started writing the next, because I can just feel where they were 2 different days. And in the same way that like actors might go onto a stage and improvise a scene, they know where it starts, they know where it ends, but we don't quite know how we're going to get there. That's my process of writing, so that I'll sit down and write a scene, and if it doesn't work, I press delete, I write it again, I write it again, I write it 100 times. But I very rarely go back and edit what's already there. I do that near the end with some polishing and that kind of thing, but my writing process is one of rewriting. So I suppose often what happens is that as I'm writing initially, it's very ponderous because I don't know who these characters are. I don't know what their names are. I don't know anything about them. And I discover them as I'm writing, and then it's a series of rewriting. So then I'll often rewrite earlier scenes once I'm much more familiar with these characters, because I suppose I don't want to have that feeling too much of the first 100 pages being a painful experience of having to witness an author discover who these characters are. And I think that can lend itself to the story a bit, but definitely at the start, like the first 50 drafts of this, I don't really write in drafts. I rewrite scenes a lot. So I never sort of sit down and consider, like, I don't write a draft and go back to the start and write again. I'm just constantly rewriting these scenes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, just there's a question in here. Well, it's not a question so much, but I was actually wondering about your thoughts on this. So Debbie Robson has said that she writes without a lot of planning as well, but she's currently stuck. So her character's about to arrive in London and she doesn't know what to do with her. Have you got any advice for Debbie? Like chuck in an explosion or something in there?
No, follow that thought. I don't know, like do whatever you want. But that's a really interesting place to be. A character arriving in London, not knowing what the next step is. Like that's a really interesting place, and that's a real place, and that feels so true to me. That's how I would feel if I landed in London. And I think that's an interesting first step to take, as someone stepping off that plane, not knowing who they are, where they are, what place is coming next. And
yeah, sure. That's a good. I like that. Yeah, it's more interesting, right? Because I feel like you'd feel it if you knew where the person in London was going to go. You would feel it as you're reading this person go, and you'd be like, oh, okay, and then they're going to do the thing. But when you don't know, us as readers, we're like, what's going to happen? It's much more intriguing, I think.
But I should say too, like I'm not in any moment advocating my writing approach, because if you saw, so this writing approach also leads to that between The Everlasting Sunday and this novel, I fully completed, I think, 4 other novels.
Oh my gosh.
So, and Loveland was rewritten so many times. So it's an incredibly inefficient way of writing.
Man.
But it's and that's why I suppose that's the reason I'm trying to challenge myself to not to not write like this, but to try and add some other tools to my kit, because I'm just getting pretty tired. I don't have it's much harder to me. So after The Everlasting Sunday, I was just on such a writing buzz.
Yeah.
I just wrote a novel, threw it away. Wrote a novel, threw it away. Wrote a novel. Like, my agent hasn't read these novels. They were just like clearing out the pipes after The Everlasting Sunday. But
whole novels.
It's a lot of energy, and I'm not getting any younger. So I'm trying to see. But also, I think it's a lot of this is me. It's kind of an evasive act by me. It's me, because I know I can do this. I know I can sit in front of a page and improvise, and I'll really enjoy myself, and I'll write something. And I always think at the end, I'll just chuck it away. And I know I can do that. But it's like dancing alone in your bedroom with no one watching. It's like, yeah, you can do it and you have a lot of fun, but there are no stakes, And so I'm trying
you're teaching yourself to risk a little bit more, maybe.
Just that I think I'm a little bit afraid of, if I sit down and really plan something out or think something through and don't just always improvise, what if there's nothing there? What if I don't have the chops to do that? What if I can only write in a kind of spontaneous, improvising way? So who knows? We'll see. So for instance, with my latest 2 novels. I'm trying to much more thoroughly plan them out before I write them.
Yeah, right.
Just to see. Maybe it'll be a disaster, but who knows?
We've got some questions, some thoughts here on what we were talking about. So Jane has said that she writes much more the way that you write, but is doing similar. So it's trying to flex and maybe outlining a little bit. But she said it sort of restricts that natural flow of where the story might lead. Do you find that too? Like it's restrictive in that way? You sort of shrug, like you feel penned into an outline?
I definitely, I find when I write, I really do. I don't know if you remember like magic eye pictures in the 80s where you had to like look at them and you had to sort of half focus. That's the only thing I can equate it to is when I write, I do metaphor, genuinely just kind of go in this half. It all sounds very mystical and cosmic, but it's true. I genuinely just enter this kind of like half. It's like meditating or something. I just kind of enter this kind, and because I'm just improvising and writing from the subconscious, I'm not referring to notes. I'm not thinking about, oh, I need. So I find having a plan gets in the way of me entering that kind of improvising dream state. But I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing for me to see what happens if I force myself to write in a different way. So I'm persisting. But yeah, I definitely do find it challenging because I've never worked off it's like working off a script. You know, it's much easier if you're a stand-up comedian, not that I am, but if you're a stand-up comedian and you just want to make it up, that's your thing. But it doesn't mean you're necessarily good at working off a script. So I'm trying to learn how to work off notes.
Yeah, you're trying to sort of become a better overarching. You're an athlete and you're doing, maybe if you're playing basketball and you can only shoot threes, you're learning how to dunk and doing all the other stuff as well now.
I think I'm learning a lot of the things that a lot of writers learn, like at the start of their writing journey. You know, like I'm learning the stuff. Like I'm buying books on how to write novels. Last year I've been buying how to write novels books. I feel like I'm just back at the start. Like I need to do some Thursday morning writing workshop. No, seriously, because I don't have that craft. I
think that's really speaking to your humility though, man. And like, I think that's talking a lot about just how seriously you take this idea of craft and becoming the best at the thing that you love to do. So I think that really speaks a lot to your humility because I just think it's really cool for you to say those sorts of things. There's a lot of people here. So Chris Parker is saying, always thought boards and planning, but then someone said that he just knew the end of the book and wrote, and if he was going away from the end, he would introduce something to get it back on track. But now I realize authors are brilliant, and they can do lots of different ways of coming at a book. And a lot of people are just saying it just seems like magic, otherworldly magic to them. All right, so let's get back to the actual novel, which, if you can believe it, we haven't really gone into deeply yet. Sorry, guys. I love talking about all these things with Rob. So the novel, I think, has these, well, it does. It has these two competing stories. And one is set in 1956 in Nebraska, where we learn about the main character really is May, and we learn about her grandmother Casey, and just sort of the starting of this idea of Loveland. To begin with, can we talk about the title? And I think Loveland is actually a fictional town, I'm assuming.
Yeah, again, another one of these slightly cosmic
okay,
things. Yeah. So yeah, it is. It's completely made up. And originally it came from my sister when she was a teenager, went out with an awful person when her first love who broke her heart, and his last name was Love. And for some reason it stuck. It was like with the first model she's much older than me, and I remember watching her relationship, and her boyfriend, ex-Love, love, I don't want to say his name, was kind of really formative for me. I remember watching, it was played out like a melodrama in my life, watching my her first love, and he treated her terribly. And so this kind of Dick Dastardly character always kind of built up in my mind of someone Love, and it kind of stayed in the back of my mind. And so we have the family that formed this town in the story. Their last name is Love. And I originally never intended to keep it as that because it's a bit hokey, right? It's a bit on the nose. It's a little bit too something. Well, I kept it, so obviously I didn't up to in the end. But
I really liked it. Yeah, I don't think it feels hokey,
like all these things, so many things, and you'd know this too from writing. You put something down as a placeholder, and once you spend 600 hours working on it, it's just burnt down into your deepest.
That's what it is now.
That's what it is.
It's no longer a placeholder.
And then I was never set on it being the name of the novel. I have a strange relationship with titles. I'm not particularly attached to titles. As in, it doesn't worry me that much, to be honest. I don't have it. I know some authors can't start writing something until they have a title, or they're very tied to it. Doesn't really form part of my writing process for some reason. So I tend to never have a title of a novel before I get to the end, and then it's like, oh god, got to come up with a title. And so I kind of put this one down as Loveland, knowing that might be a bit confusing too, because from a distance you see a novel called Loveland and you think, what is this novel? Is it a out and out romance novel? What, is it an ironic title? Is it a literal title? But then in the process of talking to my publisher and my agent, when we were talking about titles, and for them it was always Loveland. They just said that for them that was the perfect title for the story. And obviously there's a kind of irony in the title. There's kind of a contradiction in that title because it's often a very dark story. And then I went back again. I got an email from the mayor of that town who has been sending me the videos of his and I went and looked on Google Maps of where he was showing me, and it's a real life lake in Nebraska that it was kind of like the center of my basing of Loveland. And 1 mile out of that town is a region called Loveland. And I looked it up, and apparently it used to be in 100 years ago, it was the center of that town, that lake town, and it was called Loveland. And then eventually the town grew outside of that. And so it's kind of this area of the town where there's nothing there, but it's just a kind of subset region within this town called Loveland. So I don't know it's either the most insane coincidence of all time or at some point I've looked at a map and my brain has absorbed that word Loveland, or something strange is going on. So he drove, my mayor of this town drove past but in America, of course, they call it Loveland. So that was an interesting, and I've noticed too, some people who read and I don't mind that, some people who read the book pronounce it in the way you would pronounce Cleveland.
I guess that makes sense.
Loveland. Yeah. And if you met a person, they might be called like Steve Loveland, that. So I don't mind that, because I even remember the town I grew up in, Budrum on the Sunshine Coast. There was like 6 different ways to pronounce that town in the town. People didn't even agree on it in the town. So I don't mind that. It's like Birmingham or Birmingham, like people say things differently. So I don't mind that. But so Loveland is a real place in my mind, and it was once a real place that's faded off the map in real life. So who knows how these things work?
It's kind of amazing. We only have 10 minutes left, if you can believe that. I'd like to get into a few things to do with the book.
I've managed to avoid talking about that.
All this stuff is so interesting to me. Like I love talking about this stuff. I guess chat, maybe you need to put in like we need to like a get to the book sort of thing, I guess, or if we're boring. But this book is a very, very powerful book, and it has a lot to do, I think, especially with issues of coercive control and domestic violence, and those sorts of things come interweaved generationally as well, where these sorts of traumas and maybe almost like I don't know, it's somehow passed down, this idea of mentality. Can you talk a little bit about the inclusion of those themes and how you went about capturing them in such a thoughtful and I think a really hopeful way as well?
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose the main thing to say right from the start is the inclusion of those topics and themes in the story are something that I just carry very heavily on my shoulders and do not. I sometimes wish people could just like see my writing process and say there's no part of this process that I just throw in there and just don't, who cares? We'll just see how it goes.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think, I suppose just to backtrack a little bit, the way this novel started, and I actually originally started writing a version of this novel before I wrote Everlasting Sunday. So there's a version of this novel from 7 years ago, and it originally started. It was never intended to be a novel. It was never intended to be anything. It was just one of my many elongated thought exercises that I do on a page. And it originally wasn't fiction. Originally it was nonfiction. And I think it was a lot to do with some personal experiences I had and some people I've known in my life. But also, I've kind of really tracked it down to, I think the publication of Jess Hill's book, See What You Made Me Do.
Yeah, I have that over here somewhere. I'll find it. Yeah, keep going.
And that's one of those examples. Like, people often talk about, like, you know, what is the point of art, or what is the point, like these. That book, I think, was a genuine. It wasn't the first time I'd thought about these things or anything, but I think, like for a lot of people, that was a huge catalyst for me. I read that book.
For me too, man.
And I suppose I tried to actually take some of its messages to heart, and that idea of owning this stuff and self-analysis. And so I originally just sat down in front of my page, I think inspired by that book and inspired by thinking about these things. And I really wanted to examine these ideas of male, and I think it's really important to say male violence and male coercive control, and look at that in terms of myself and the life I lead. And because it's something, when I sit down with my friends at a pub and we talk about this, and we often talk about how terrible this is, but it's always something happening far away. It's happening to someone else in someone else's life. It's never us. It's always somewhere else. But it is us, and it is around us, and it is amongst men. Yeah. And so I really wanted to sit down and look at, is this the capacity for this violence, for this control? Is this something in all men? Is this a capacity within all men, even if they hide it from themselves? And is this a capacity within me? And so I sat down and originally wrote really just analyzing myself, I suppose. And then I just kept working on this. And eventually, I think just because of the way I write and my reflex, I guess I am a novelist. And this thing evolved into being a novel. But initially, and this was never intended to be published, I should say this before I describe it because it sounds terrible. The book initially centered entirely on the male characters. And so I was looking at these male characters, and I suppose trying to find, where's the seed of this? Where's the nub? Where's the origin of this stuff? And so I wrote these male characters that feature in the novel now, and I wrote about their backstories and their childhoods and their histories and their life experiences and going to war and their fathers and their mothers and all this stuff. I suppose just trying to get to the bottom of this within myself and within characters. And I would write this novel and just hit a brick wall. I'd get to the end and think, I've achieved nothing through writing this. So I'd write it again and again. So I think I wrote about 6 versions of this novel completely from scratch, looking at the male characters. And when I got to the end, I reached the conclusion that you would reach even before you wrote it, was that obviously there is a million reasons, but there are no excuses for this. And obviously that's something you would know inherently before you wrote it. But I had to go through the process of writing that and looking at it myself. And then when I got to the end and I'd lived with these characters for so long, and I'd experienced these men's actions and the inheritance of these actions through generations, that I found the only thing I could do within the universe of this novel, the author, the one power I have is whose perspective I tell these stories from. So it was a really conscious, punitive act to push the men outside of this novel. I've banished the men from this novel, from outside of the page of this novel. So they're present in this story entirely through their actions and their culpability, but their day-to-day is not on that story. And that was a conscious act, and it's not a solution to anything, but this was my reaction to having lived with these characters for so long. So it became a novel entirely of these women moving around these seemingly immovable objects. So I suppose that's how I, in a very long way, got to the place of this novel.
That's really interesting, mate. Like, I feel like you can feel the depth of that stuff, you know, with that old iceberg thing of Ernest Hemingway, right? Like there's all these unseen depths underneath all the decisions and stuff. So you can definitely feel the depth of you working these things out, I think, throughout the course of the novel. EJ has said here, loved your novel. It took me on a really emotional journey. Thank you, which is really awesome.
Thank you. It's amazing.
Yeah. Can you talk very quickly? Because I think this is probably about the last question we have, but I've been really wondering about the relationship between the main character, May, and then
Hmm.
her teenage
Hmm.
son, which I think is really interesting. I think you did such a good job with that, in that I felt it was so difficult,
Hmm.
but there was there was love there. I just, yeah. Can you talk about crafting that so well?
Yeah, I think well thank you. But I think I suppose I like the idea in stories. I think there's this kind of assumption that you might take if you've never written a novel or something, that there's this idea that you have all your characters and you fully write out their backstories and their connections and you put it all on the page. And that's a very reasonable thing to think and assume. But I suppose in a lot of my stories, I like to work with what I think of as kind of white space in the
Mm,
story, because that's my experience of life. People I've known and loved my entire life, but there are these great gaps between us, these great silences, these great unknowing elements between us. So I suppose I try and get some of that across. It would have been much easier for me to have May and her son have moments where they sat down and
mm.
they bridged this gap, or
And they explained everything.
they
Yeah.
explain this stuff. But there are these frustrations between them in the same way that we have gaps between people we love. There are these unexplained, why can't this work? It's like a relationship. It's like why isn't this working? What's this
Mm,
gap between us? And I suppose some of it's from as well. I've got a 6-year-old son, and I've thought now about maybe some of this is a playing out of my own anxieties about my own son, and
yeah.
so maybe I've obviously we project onto our writing and we project
Yeah, for
onto our
sure.
reading. So I guess
For
some of that
sure.
stuff is there. But I suppose I just wanted to get on the page this, what to me feels like an emotional truth or something, that those unknowable gaps between people, and I let them remain gaps at
Yeah.
times. I didn't feel that compulsion that I need to bridge this gap.
I think
Um,
that feels uncomfortable as a reader. We
yeah.
read it and we're like, we instinctually want it to be resolved and we want everyone
Mm.
to feel happy at the end. But I like that you left it as this sort of true to life monument, in that there's not a quick fix, there's
Yeah.
no just tick a box and tie a bow and everyone's happy, it's stuff to
I think
work
too,
through.
part of that comes from and I must say it took 18 months of convincing from my agent, my publisher, and this book was read by so many people more than I have in the past, because I took a lot of convincing that I wanted to even publish this novel. Because I'm not entirely convinced. I'm quite happy to. Is it my place to publish this novel, to write this story? Is this a story I like?
Yeah, it's a good question.
It's something, and I don't. I obviously got to the point that I'm very comfortable with writing this novel, and I'm very proud of this novel, and I think it was written with nothing but empathy and compassion and love, um, but it might not be right for some people. So it took a lot of convincing for me to to publish this novel. Um, so I guess I'm so grateful when people um, come back to me and speak to me about this novel. But likewise, I'm just as happy to hear if this was not okay for some people. Like that's some of the experiences you have at book clubs and things. That's that
Yeah.
it, I love that just as much, and it's even better that we get to talk to someone about why it wasn't or why it is, and because we're all complex beasts, aren't we? We all come to
Yeah,
this.
for
The
sure.
Brisbane I know is different to the Brisbane you know, so the worlds of these novels are different depending on your life experience. So I'm just grateful that anyone gets to read it, and even better if I get to talk to someone about it.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that's a lovely note to end on, I think. Susan has said, you articulate your writing and thoughts so well, Robert, such a heart and depth. Thank you so much for sharing, and it was a pleasure to read. I've got a lot of people saying powerful novel, Debbie said. Um, Loved your novel. There's a lot of people who really responded to this book, mate. So um,
Thank you.
we're really grateful for your time tonight. And it's always very nice to talk to you. And some people are saying, there's actually a few people who are saying they haven't yet read the book, but now that we've spoken about it for so long, they're like really excited to read it, which I guess is really cool. Um, Susan is actually being quite brave here. Do you have a couple extra minutes, mate? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Sorry to keep you.
No, I'm fine.
Susan is saying that she has had a real relationship. I'm sorry, Susan, if this is okay for me to say. I'm assuming just because you put it into the chat there, but she's had a domestic violence relationship, in that she would be a bit scared to actually read the book. Um, I guess that's fair enough, right? I mean, how would you
Oh,
respond to that? That's completely understandable, right?
more than understandable. Like it's
Yeah,
you know, I really don't even quite know how to answer it beyond just saying um
it's
this.
awful, right? It's just
Yeah, but, it's interesting. We all come to everything with this kind of like three dimensional matrices of experience and points of view based on who we are, and then I'm this author with my three-dimensional matrices of complicated links, and then I write a novel and kind of put it between us, and it's not always going to fit.
mm,
um, and I would never expect, in the same reason that it took 18 months for me to be convinced that
mm,
it was, I had to have enough people read it and respond positively to it or warmly to it. Or I've had so many, probably so much more than my first novel. I've had so many people reach out to me and send me. I got one today from someone that just made me stop in my tracks. Emails from people who have had experiences, obviously not the same, but like in some way
yeah,
mirroring the stuff in this story. And people I've never met, people sending me emails, you know, 2,000 word emails telling me their
wow,
entire life stories about their experiences and things that it rang true for them, or things that they've come to peace with, or they felt kind of in tune with that. So I suppose I'd just say that it's something that I really tried to write this novel with absolutely nothing. There's not one element of this novel that was thrown in just for a bit of
yeah,
a story element. This is something I take it much more seriously than that, and so it's something that was written with um, nothing but a sense of empathy, but a sense of reality and truth as
yeah,
well, as best as I could depict it. And that's about all I can say about that, really. And I
yeah. I
and
think
I
I think that's really special that you've been able to bridge, like you say, it's like a bridge over to perhaps people who have always felt very isolated and alone in their experience,
having
and
said
you,
that, but also I'm not suggesting. I feel like I'm just one. I
yeah,
just wanted to add something to the world in a very small way that my novel is,
hmm,
that was a even in the smallest way a positive. Not gentle's not the right word, but I wanted this thing to, in once everything is balanced out, that it led on the peaceful side of the ledger,
yeah,
of the
yeah.
world, that
I
was
understand. Yeah,
something I battle with a lot. And to me, that's a balance between trying to represent some truth and fact in this hard analysis I did of myself and the
mm,
capacity for men for this. And I always, what I'm talking about here is men, gendered violence, gendered coercion. Um, and that's something that I take in, incredibly seriously when in the writing of this novel. But
I can tell.
and I guess one of my biggest concerns about writing this novel is that I didn't want to suggest that I'm a middle-aged man who solved anything, or
No,
a
no, of
middle-aged
course,
man who's finally cracked anything. I just
no.
wanted something that I think in after the wash would be considered on the positive side of the ledger, and that's all I can really hope for.
Yeah, and I think going back to what we were talking about with reading, I think it just connects. It can connect people, and the
Mm.
connection is a type of or a form of love. And even if it's very fleeting and quick, and it's just a small little thing, like you're saying, but it can mean a lot, I think, to a lot of people. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of people in the chat who are saying very similar things about this book meaning a lot to them. So, yeah, we'll have to end it there, man. But I just really appreciate you. Appreciate this book. If you haven't read it yet, you can still get the book on the Libby app. I think for the rest of the month through your local library. If you download the Libby app, you can get the ebook for the rest of the month. But makes an awesome conversation starter, I think, as well, right? Like it's a book you really weigh up and have chats like we've just had tonight about. So definitely worth investing your time into. And yeah, Robert, thank you guys in the chat as well. You guys have been really cool tonight. I guess, can we give a round of applause for Robert? I don't know how we do this.
Do it right back at you.
Yay.
Thank you so much, everyone. It really means so much on to me, a freezing cold weekday night to sit here and like I said, like you have these events, and there
Mm,
was bits there. you unexpectedly tap into some pretty special places. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and it really means a lot.
Thank you, Robert. Next month we have Tony Birch, and we're looking at The White Girl, which I'm embarrassed to say I haven't read yet, but I've started it now and I'm really enjoying it so far. So I'm looking forward to having you all back then. But other than that, have a good night, everyone. And yeah, Robert, you're the best. Look forward to reading whatever you do next, man.
Thank you. Hoorah, everyone. Thank you.
All right, bye, guys.